Hello, my name is Deirdre Cross, and I'm the Assistant Director of Public Programs of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Historically Speaking, Stephen Reed, First Best Lessons in Leadership and Legacy from Today's Civil Rights Movement. The Historically Speaking series is highly interactive and brings people in touch with the most evocative and creative thinkers of our time. So during the program, we encourage you to share comments and questions in the chat portion of your screen. Near the end of the conversation, staff will collect your comments and submit them to our panelists. Additionally, we've embedded a link enabling you to order First Best while you watch. In the memoir tonight, Stephen Reed shares the life lessons passed on to him by his parents, especially his outgoing and courageous father, Joe L. Reed, himself a civil rights organizer committed to securing social justice in his community. In the process, Joe made an indelible imprint on his son, as we'll learn from the conversation this evening. In November of 2019, the Honorable Stephen Reed was elected as the 57th Mayor of Montgomery, Alabama, and the first African American to hold this office. He was reelected earlier this year and looks forward to another very successful second term. Joining him to discuss First Best, we are pleased to welcome Michel Martin, morning host of NPR's award-winning Morning Edition. We hope you'll enjoy this program.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us wherever you happen to be. Where we are, it's really cold, so we're happy to be warm and inside. Mayor Reed, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being part of this discussion.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So, Mayor, I'm just going to start right with the basic question. Busy people, in my experience, write a book for a reason. It's not like you don't have anything else to do. I mean, you are not just the mayor of the capital city of Alabama and beginning your second term. You're a dad, you have 3 kids, you're a husband, you're active doing a lot of things. So as I said, busy people write a book for a reason. What was yours?
I think to try to relate my story and that of the civil rights generation to where we are right now, and in particular to young Black boys and young Black girls who see so many images and see so many things via social media and in today's media space that don't really correlate to, I think, how we have made the progress we have in this country and as a nation overall. And I think, being able to tell that story in a way of how I learned from my father and his generation to pass that down to the next generation of leaders is something I want to share.
It's a memoir, but it's not just a memoir. So talk a little bit about what the book is. It has kind of, it's not a classic memoir in that it does several things. So to say a little bit more about what the book does.
Yeah, I don't know if my story is exciting enough to be just a classic memoir, in particular at this stage of life. But I think this is kind of, half memoir and half, blueprint for, those young people who are in spaces right now and they may not be able to figure out how to get out of them in terms of leading and changing the landscape for where they sit and where they are. And what I wanted to share was here's some of the tenets, here's some of the principles that I learned from my father and my mother and their generation that grew up in segregated Alabama, things that I took to help me get to where I am as the first Black mayor of Montgomery, but also things that I think any leader, young or old, can adapt and can utilize themselves in terms of how they apply that to their current situation to uplift others. And I think that's what we're all called to do in today's civil rights movement.
Your folks loom large in this book, and you start there. So I feel like it's okay for me to start there. Your father is a giant in Alabama politics and civic life. I mean, he was executive secretary of the Alabama State Teachers Association. He sort of presided over the merger of what had been the all-Black teachers union and the all-white teachers union, which was not an easy thing to do. I think people forget just how hard a thing that was to do. He's one of the original members of the elected city council in Montgomery. I did not know until I read this book that he lost his own father when he was just 8 years old. His father was murdered in Pittsburgh. And how do you think that affected him? And how do you think it affected the way he parented you and your siblings?
Yeah, well, I think the easy thing is to start with how he parented us was not having a father himself. I think he always wanted to make sure that he was there for us, even through a busy schedule of professionalism and activism. Those were things that I think he really stressed and still does. To this day, he's 85 years old, just with him over the Thanksgiving break. So he's still that father. He's still parenting and giving us that guidance and wisdom, if you will. And I think because, he didn't have that in his life, he wanted to make sure he was not only there for us, but even my cousins and other members of our family. And I think, when you lose a parent, and I can only, imagine myself, but just having been told through his eyes, it's traumatic. It changes everything. It shakes up your world. And you really have to figure out who to lean on and who to trust. And that comes with mistakes. That comes with setbacks. That comes with challenges. And we try to share that in the book as well, that there's no straight line to leadership or successful leadership model. Usually it zigs and zags, but it's how we respond. And I think for my father to have to deal with that at such an early age, growing up in, pretty much poverty here in Alabama, was challenging. But he had a village of family. He had a village of people in the community that surrounded him and tried to help him. And then he went off to the Army before coming back stateside and going to college here, where he was immediately got into the protest movement, leading sit-ins right here in Montgomery, Alabama in 1960. So I think having to fight for everything, really made him who he is, and that has been passed down to all of us.
Well, one of the things I got a real kick out of is you talk about the way he and your mother were always teaching you and your siblings. In fact, you could have written a whole book. In fact, there's definitely some Hallmark greeting cards in some of his sayings that I'm sure you can recite in your sleep. You want to recite one or two of them just so that we know that you've ingrained them all? I loved all of them. Give your service, but never your soul. That was one.
Yeah.
What are some of the others that come to mind?
Don't send your lunch by a hungry boy.
In your sleep. Go ahead.
Don't send your lunch by a hungry boy, because he'll eat it.
Okay, that was a good one. Let your handshake be your contract, and your.
That was really my second one. Yeah.
Yeah. What's another one?
I think the one you mentioned. Don't give your service, but never your soul. Remember the hottest place in hell is reserved for those who don't take a stand. So those, I could go down the whole list.
You really could. Let me just say that there's quite a list here, and like I say, if someone hasn't thought of it already, there's definitely some greeting cards in here. And some folks say politics is dirty. Politics is a noble profession. It's politricks that's dirty. That just sort of gives you a sample. He talk about one of the things that I appreciated about the book is you talked about how your parents, and you give them both their due. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. We're going to talk about why you are careful to give both your parents, your dad and your mom, their due. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But the fact that they brought you along in their activities, right? But there came a moment where you saw not just the fun side of it. Can you just talk about the time you answered your father's phone and what that taught you, or what happened? And just tell that story if you would.
Yeah, that was man, that was a troubling experience for a long time for me. Growing up in my household, not realizing the proximity of the civil rights movement to when I was growing up in the early to mid 80s. I just didn't appreciate, 15 years like I appreciate 15 years now of my life. But how, recent that is for us. And, growing up, we just heard about the assassinations of Dr. King and Medgar Evers and certainly President Kennedy and Senator Robert Kennedy. We heard about that. I mean, like it was, yesterday. And so when I was in elementary school and I come home and we're always told not to answer my father's phone. And we had two separate lines at that time in the house. And when I answered the phone, I just answered it. Parks, I was in there doing some homework, and a voice came over and said, well, is Joe Reed there? And I said, no. And the person said, well, tell him if he doesn't shut up, we're going to blow his bleep, head off. And, they said it with a level of passion and intensity that for, I think, any, young person, 8 or 9 years old, as I was at the time, would have taken it, seriously. And so, I say in the book that I actually wet myself. I mean, it was that real. It was like that person was right outside the window. And again, we had always been told not to answer the phone. My father always pulled into the garage. And so we knew the story of Medgar Evers being shot and killed in his driveway. We knew that as if it was, again, something that had just recently happened. So when that person said that on the phone, I mean, it sent chills through my spine. I mean, it sounded like it was about to happen right then. And there's no way I could give it the level of intensity of the way the caller said it then. And I just, as I got older, I thought about, you knew you were talking to a child. That showed a level of cowardice, but it also showed the level of hate that my father dealt with and many of his generation dealt with, just in trying to bring equality to Black people, not only here in Alabama, but, throughout the country.
How did he deal with that? Tell us the story of how he dealt with that. What did he say to you when you told him what happened?
Well, one way he dealt with it was he carried his own, pistol. So I think that's important to acknowledge. I didn't know until one of my older cousins kind of pointed that out. So he carried his own as well. But, for us, he wanted to make sure that we didn't keep hate in our hearts and that bigotry was not a place that, we resided in, and that we had to look past that and we had to look over people like that. And, part of his work and part of his teaching to us was, hey, I'm doing this so that not only you all have it better, but that, my grandkids will have it better and your friends will have it better and their kids will have it better. So it was really kind of to be above it. And that was the teaching, and that was the lessons that we were being instilled with was, you got bad people, but you've also got, good people and come in all colors, shapes and sizes and shades. He was very adamant that there, and still is, there's been no movement of progress for Black people in this country that did not have, white people who were as committed and was willing to sacrifice just as much, from the abolitionist movement all the way through the civil rights movement. So he always made sure to balance what we may have seen and what we heard with that, there are multiple sides to this, and not to just take one person or a few people's, mindset or words as being, representative of the whole.
How do you think, I mean, I don't want to dwell on this because just one story of many, but how do you think that affected you being exposed to that at such a young age?
Yeah, I think for me, it made me grow up. It made me understand that we were a little bit different. In my house, my father was viewed a little bit different. And again, this being the mid 80s, when you think about 1960, you think about the turbulent times you had there, it wasn't, just unimaginable for that to happen. In particular with the rhetoric that was often, just beneath the surface here in politics in the state of Alabama. So I think it made us grow up. I think it steeled us a little bit. And I think it really toughened our skin to be able to hear criticism, whether it was at school from kids, but even adults, or whether it was things that we might read or we might hear about our father from, others in the public. So we had to have a thick skin. We had to be able to deal with the challenges that come with public scrutiny as a young child. But we also, had to think about there may be a day when dad doesn't come home. There may be a day when something does happen to dad. And we talked about it. He talked about it a lot. This is what you do. This is who should take care of whom. And this is what you have to be prepared to do as a young boy going to a young man should something happen. And we just had those conversations, and we had to be prepared that, we could be in that same situation because that was the reality.
Who are the Moses, or what is the Moses generation? And how is that different from the Joshua generation?
Yeah, I talk about that in First Best of hearing that first said by President Obama at the time when he was running for president as the then United States Senator, and pointed to that civil rights generation, the John Lewis's, the Diane Nash's, the Andrew Young's, the Fred Shuttlesworths, the Ralph Abernathy's, all of those luminaries. But then, many of those who were doing things at a level in their respective states, like my father and so many others, that were those student leaders, in the 60s that helped found organizations like SNCC and others that were leading the protest movement, being that generation that got us through even after Dr. King was assassinated, to see the Voting Rights Act come to fruition, to see the impact being felt as Black elected officials were, got to office throughout the South and throughout so many parts of this country after the Voting Rights Act. But the Joshua generation kind of being many of us that came in a time when we may not have understood the full struggle and how it took place, but certainly we are the beneficiaries of that sacrifice, we're the beneficiaries of that leadership, that courage, and that commitment. And I think as President Obama, so pointedly said to all of us, that there's a level of, responsibility that we have, not to just do things for the corporate title, not to just do things for the corporate bonus, but to do things that continue to help change the paradigm in our country. Because while the challenge sounds and maybe looks a little different, the challenges are still there even throughout the progress. And so I count myself and so many other leaders as part of the Joshua generation, not just political, but also corporate, philanthropic, actors and entertainers, athletes, influencers. So many of us who are pushing that paradigm through journalism in a way that, you didn't have all of these or as many ways of influencing, several generations ago as we do now. And I think that's, who we are called to be. And I think that's who, again, President Obama so aptly, coined us to really lead, us into that promised land. And what does that look like? And to understand that it's not just, a straight line, understand it's not necessarily all smooth and downhill, but there are going to be some uphill challenges. There are going to be some, hard battles that we continue to have to fight. And we see that playing out each and every day.
Well, also, here's the thing for people who aren't as familiar with their Hebrew scriptures as perhaps they could be. But, part of the issue here is that, Moses, for all of his bravery in leading the Hebrew slaves out of slavery in Egypt, never got to see the promised land. I mean, that's kind of the story. It was Joshua who actually had to, lead them to the next step. Here's what's interesting for me is I don't really see, and I've kind of gone through my Bible, I don't really see where Joshua criticized Moses for the things that he could have done better. And one of the things that I found interesting about your book is that you were willing to, in a very nice and respectful way, I want to say, you point out some shortcomings of that first wave of civil rights leaders. And one of them one of the shortcomings you pointed out is the lack of respect for women, or at least the lack of respect for women's leadership. And I'd like you to talk, first, I'd like you to talk more about that. And secondly, I'd like you to tell me more about why you thought it was important to say that.
Well, I'm the mayor of Montgomery, Alabama, and in another day or two, we will celebrate the anniversary of Rosa Parks finally sitting down on a Montgomery bus, which led to the now well-known Montgomery bus boycott, which thrust Dr. King into the national conversation of leadership as a young pastor, 26 years old, had not been in Montgomery for 1 year, but for many, many years. The Women's Political Council and those ladies like Joanne Robinson and so many others were overshadowed. That story was not really told. Even the story of Mrs. Parks kind of was, sanitized and downplayed. And I think as I got a little older, I started to learn more about the true history of the Montgomery bus boycott and the role that women played in it, and understanding again, the nature of the times that men were out front, not just politically, but just throughout society. And women's, their rights had not been fully established, and it would not be for years to come at that point. So I thought it was important that we again identify the reality of the progress that has been made in this country. And so when we talk about being the first and we talk about being the best, that doesn't just mean that it is perfect, doesn't just mean that it is, just 100% clean. There are things that happen that I think in the movement has come out recently, not just through books and other venues like that, but also through personal testimony that the women did not get the credit. I've heard Ambassador Andrew Young say that many times about who played what role and what the role of women really was. And so I think it was important for me to share that because it had not been explained in my mind in a way that was relevant to even young women and young girls right now. Because again, this book is really for that, generation of leaders, young generation of leaders right now who are thinking about things and who view the civil rights movement as being, many solar systems away, many galaxies away, just something they can't relate to. And so the goal is to try to share that, that evolution through my story of being present, but also to motivate, those young people who are in it right now. And I think quite often young girls and young women may not see themselves as identified in the movement as we know they were. I mentioned Diane Nash earlier and Joanne Robinson. And again, even when we think about Rosa Parks, we all often forget about Mary Louise Smith and Miss Claudette Colvin, who were protesting before even Mrs. Parks as teenagers right here in Montgomery. So I just think it's important for us to highlight that and for us to tell the whole story, and even in its imperfections, to appreciate what was done without technology, without Black political power and real Black economic power, but was done through the collective of courage and commitment. And I think when you tell that whole story, then you sum up the role that so many women, Mrs. Coretta Scott King and others, played in this movement, whether it was Miss Georgia Gilmore, who was feeding the protesters at one point here in Montgomery, or whether it was those student leaders that were women as well, who were right there, the sit-ins and protesting in Nashville, Tennessee, and Rock Hill, South Carolina, and Birmingham, Alabama, Little Rock, and so many other places around the South.
Well, what I also thought it was interesting, though, is that you pointed out that some of the small c conservatism persists in the way that leaders are shaped. I thought it was very interesting that, and you made clear how much you love your Morehouse, you're, proud alum, but that you point out how the sort of the how can I put it, that the shaping of leadership takes some fairly narrow forms. Okay, like, if you are interested in political science, you got to go to law school. If you're interested in business or math, then you've got to be go to investment banking. And I mean, I have to say, I found it refreshing because I've seen, I have family members who went to Morehouse. I haven't shared this part of it with them yet. But I just thought it was interesting that you called out that there are, the fact that there are not only a few ways to be a leader, to be of influence, and to be important to the culture, to move, people forward. I just thought that was very interesting, and it's one of the few times I've heard a public figure say that. And I'm curious about what motivated you to say that.
Well, because I try to share as I, personal stories in the book that I'm far from perfect. All of us are. But I think, quite frankly, when we have told the story of many leaders, in particular Black leaders in the country, it's almost felt we had to overcompensate for them and kind of present them as these perfect mythical figures. And none of them were. I certainly am not, and those of us who were trying to lead in our different capacities at this time aren't. And so, again, when we're trying to motivate and inspire young people who are leading, I think it's important for us to be very honest with them, to be candid and to talk about, hey, I didn't get all A's, to talk about I got in trouble in school at times, and to talk about some of the challenges socially that we may have had, because we want people to be able to see themselves that despite all of those things, look at where we are, look at what we've been able to do with faith, with support system around us, with encouragement. But you don't have to be this mythical figure, all or nothing caricature that says, if I'm not, just on this one path, then I can't make a difference in my community because this is the image that, we have presented. And I think that does our community a disservice. I think it does our country a disservice. We have to make sure that we humanize our leaders and we show them in their imperfections. And regardless of religion, I think there are enough examples there of prophets and others that also fit that example. And when we bring it back to, present day, I think it's important for us in a social media world where everything seems to be weighed by how many followers you have and how many clicks you get and how many likes you have, that we share that there are shortcomings, if you will, there are imperfections and there are things that we can all work on, but it doesn't have to stop you from being impactful in what may be your calling, what may be your purpose. And that may take different forms. And so academically, culturally at Morehouse, being founded in the basement of a church, you have a mindset of what it means to lead and how that comes, biblically and what that really looks like, but also being able to adapt that to where young people are today, both men and women, that may not be as closely affiliated with religion or the church at all, but to be able to say to them, you can still lead, you can still have an impact, and don't just think of it through these narrow lanes that you must stay in, or you must know that you really want to be in, because God knows that wasn't the case for me. And I'm here, and I think that, we're doing good work with a lot more work ahead of us. But it's important to understand that it doesn't all have to look and sound, smell and taste the same and even feel the same just because that was one person's path to leadership and making an impact wherever they may be planted.
So did people bring up the fact that you were not a great student when you were running for mayor and that you were kind of a little bit of a hellion? Did that come up?
It didn't come up because I made that clear. I laid all my sins bare. I never, acted like, I was the summa cum laude graduate at Morehouse. I was cum laude. I had honors, but I was very, practical. And that's the thing about when you run for office back home. People know your story now, whether you.
Right. Well, that was kind of funny. And I just want to remind folks who, if you've just joining our conversation, I'm speaking with the mayor of Montgomery, Alabama. We're talking about his new memoir plus, leadership guide. It's called First Best. But I also want to invite you to join our conversation. You can put your questions into the chat and I will get them. I will see them. So apologies if I look away because that's what I'm doing. I'm giving you my full attention, Mayor, but I'm also looking at the questions that are coming in on the chat. And so we have some questions coming in for you about that. Before I go to the questions, I want to point out that you, before you became mayor, you were a probate judge. And I don't know whether this is something that got national attention, but I know that, one of the things that within the state that was noteworthy is that you were the first probate judge to issue same-sex marriage licenses once the Supreme Court determined that states could not individually bar people from getting married. And this was at a time when there were some fairly aggressive efforts to prevent people from getting those licenses. And I was just interested, as briefly as you can, because I do want to get to the questions, how you came to that decision. Speaking of leadership.
For me, the decision was clear cut. One, the United States Supreme Court had issued a ruling, and as a officer of the court, we were bound by it. So to me, it was very, very easy. And I tell people this, and I've said it since 2015. I think I said I don't know that I stepped out as much as everybody else stepped back, and so. It was one of those situations where it was like, well, the Supreme Court has issued this order. What do you mean you're not going to follow it? And it really, kind of harkened back to what my father and so many others, Attorney Fred Gray and so many others, notable, legends around Alabama had shared with me about Alabama's defiant stance around court orders, whether it was integrating schools, integrating public facilities. There's always been this thing of Alabama, kind of being defiant towards the federal courts. And, at the time, it was one of those times I was like, I can't believe we're even here. We're even having this discussion. So one, it was legally what we were bound to do, but, I also thought it was the right thing to do. I thought it was certainly the right thing to do because of what the courts had issued, and who were we to get into this, arguing back and forth, philosophically or theologically about, what marriage is and what it shouldn't be. I mean, the same things have been said, obviously, about people from different races in generations, before. So I felt like it was time for Montgomery to take a stand, and I felt like having been, the first Black probate judge and the counties and the youngest in the county's history, that was a way for us to show that we were a different county. We were a different community than the one that fought so hard against school integration, that fought so hard against the integration of public pools and other public facilities here. So I did want to, make a statement that we were different. I've been voted in that position, and had a sheriff at the time who was a fraternity brother of mine, as well, also African-American. And here we were sitting right in this crucible of, Supreme Court Chief Justice Roy Moore, threatening probate judges and others that, go strip us of our powers. It was like, that's not happening here. But we had to say that. But so many of my colleagues felt the pressure. I mean, this is real. They felt the pressure that they had to go along with it, even though both legally and as some share with me personally, they disagree with it. They felt the social pressure to go along with the obstruction. And I just felt that we had to turn the page and we had to call out the people like the forces like Roy Moore for who they were at the time. And so it did get national attention again, not thinking when we issued the ruling that it would, but it did. And I think that our community is better for how we were viewed and how we led versus the mindset and the really the approach that Chief Justice Roy Moore took at that time.
So we're going to skip past the whole. There's a very long sort of not very long, but a kind of a long discussion of how after your initial resistance to being in elected life, to the point where you were actually lecturing one of your mentors about why you were never going to run for anything, and you were not going to go back to Montgomery.
Yeah.
So we'll skip all past all that, and you can talk about that some other time, about how you finally, after being, the other PK, politician's kid, you were like, never going to do it. You finally did. One of the questions that we have from the audience is, what were your goals for running? What were your goals in running for mayor, and what are they now?
My goals were really to change the city, to change the culture, even the mindset, by showing what was possible, by showing what we could do through preparation and performance. And, from a policy standpoint, I had long tried to advocate for increased funding for our public schools, even though I don't manage our public schools day to day. I just thought that we needed more money. People would say, well, money doesn't fix all problems. And my thing is, well, ask somebody if they'd rather be richer or rather they be poor. And most people are going to say, I'd rather have more money than have less of it. If for nothing else, it gives me options and allows me to cover up mistakes and other, areas, right? So that was a big issue. And we passed that within my first year for the first time in the history of our county. We had never voted for an increase for public schools. We had been at the state mandated minimum since the state implemented a minimum 40 years ago. There didn't even used to be a minimum for, Negro schools, as they were called at that time. And so this was the first time we had done it. And I had tried to do that as probate judge. And it was one of the reasons why I ran, because I couldn't put my finger on the scale, as probate judge. I could not direct things the way I wanted to direct them and being here. So that was one thing, was certainly the education component. And I'm proud that the citizens of our community voted for 60-40. And we saw other communities then come and model their approach to funding for public schools after hours. Because guess what? Like anything else, the cost of business was going up and we weren't keeping up, but yet we expected our students who were, 95% free and reduced lunch with so many Title I schools to just make magic and just be able to do things without it. And Michelle, just kind of harken back to a time again that my mom and dad talked about it when they didn't have books in their schools in rural Alabama.
And had to build the school themselves. I mean, that's just one of the other interesting stories that you tell, which I think some people know very well, which some people may not have been aware of at all, is that in some communities, if the Black community wanted a school, they had to literally build it themselves. And the school the middle school that your dad went to, that was the case. And then if the school the state would send a teacher, maybe. And a number of people are really interested in your election as Montgomery's first Black mayor. And people are curious about a number of things. They're wondering if you felt you've experienced prejudice as the first Black mayor. And some other people are also, okay, well, you can tell us about that. And then they're also curious if you get support from other Black mayors.
Yes, definitely.
All right.
So the prejudice side, I think, comes from the fact that everybody wants to see change, but no one wants to go through it. So I think symbolically, many in this community, in particular, some of the institutional leaders, or the community leaders, were fine with the symbolic change, but not with the philosophical change. So when you ask about kind of some of the goals as mayor, it was also to change the economic paradigm here in the South. I like to say that we talk the 3 Ps, but we don't talk about a 4 P. We talk prayer, protest, and politics here in Alabama, but we don't talk profit. So, we don't talk about money. We don't talk about capitalism. We don't talk about how to start and grow small businesses. When we think about Black enterprises, entrepreneur of the century was A.G. Gaston, based right out of Birmingham, Alabama. But we never really had someone of that magnitude. We had others who were very successful. But when you start to talk about changing the economic paradigm, now you're getting into some different waters. And so I think for me, that's been something that I got from listening to Maynard Jackson many, many years ago, talking about the ballot, the book, and the buck.
Of Atlanta, first Black
mayor. Yes, first Black mayor of Atlanta, elected in 1973. And that's kind of been a blueprint of how do we change the economic paradigm to go along with the political power that we've had, not taking anything away from anyone, but just bringing more people to opportunity. And so we really wanted to make sure that was a part, as well as investing in the urban core in neighborhoods that had just suffered for decades under lack of investment, and what type of policies bring about a community with more opportunity where, as I say, everyone can live, learn, and earn. And so as you get to the prejudice part of it, that comes in the sense of how your power is respected versus that of my predecessors. And what I realized probably shortly after COVID, everything was, nice and killed during the period of COVID, because that hit us in the first 100 days. But after we got out of COVID, the reality of politics and power and influence starts to seep in. And there's this notion, well, first you raise taxes, which we've never done here for a school system, which is overwhelmingly Black and poor. That's going to increase my property taxes. Then we have COVID. Then we have George Floyd. And we had a civil unrest, right? And we had these challenges in our term. And there's just not, the due given to the person in the office as it had been to my predecessors, because now things look different. It sounds different.
Yeah, say more about that. I'm just, maybe you could just be more explicit about what you're saying, because my recollection of it was that a lot of mayors struggled with, first of all, George Floyd was killed when the country was still dealing with COVID.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of feelings about the fact that even though people had been told to stay home, shutter their businesses, not go to work, that there were these big street demonstrations, and people were like, well, whoa, what is this all about? Like, why are you not, telling these people to go home? Or why, there were lots of mayors, lots of, not just mayors, but a lot of people, but mayors, look, urban centers tended to be the places where people want to gather because they want to be in the eyes of leaders. So tell me more about that. Like, what are you saying? Are you saying that you don't feel like your leadership was respected during that period, or what? Say more.
Well, I certainly don't think that it was appreciated for what we did and what we kept from happening. We were the only city in the state of Alabama without any property damage or any people arrested during those protests. That was done in large part because of our grassroots community led in a great way and protested peacefully. But at the same time, it was also due to crisis management of me going out on one of those first days of the protest, going to E.D. Nixon Elementary School, not by accident, and acknowledging what the city had not done. That created this chasm of the haves and have-nots, that created the economic inequality and the educational inequality that we see, and acknowledging that and putting that in the context of a son of the city and a son of someone who had led for change decades before I was even thought about, much less in office. And so there was a construct that I had to go and listen to protesters tell me what they were upset about, and take it as the first Black mayor who's in office for less than a year, but also to say, I understand where you're coming from. I realize your frustration. And I don't think that approach was really respected by much of the white community here, in part because the language was different, the delivery was different. In some ways, I was saying to many of them, we're here because of what you have not done. And that's always hard for anyone to take. I understand that. But the level of respect given to not just the history that we made by becoming the first Black mayor, I've always been about substance, as and systems over symbols. So it wasn't just symbolic for me. It was, what are you going to do that's different? And as we started to talk about different policies, we introduced different approaches to things to support Black businesses, to provide support for older, historic Black neighborhoods. There was a resistance to that. There was a pushback to that. And I kind of said to one of the leaders here, I said, well, I won with 2/3 of the vote. And in the conversation, well, maybe you just got 70%. I'm thinking to myself, we got 67%. We got more than any other, contested election mayor has gotten in this city, Black or white. And the bar just kept moving. And it was, well, maybe if you can just do this magic trick, then we'll respect you. It was as much, racial, generational, as well as philosophical, all of these things being combined together, I think led to some of the challenges we saw in that first term.
You
And
think
so,
that if you perhaps, I'm just to be blunt about it, if you had been a white mayor and had managed these dual crises, both COVID and the civil unrest, in the same way, that people would have been more appreciative.
I would have been Citizen of the Year in every organization. I wouldn't have been challenged with a unknown, unqualified opponent who was bankrolled to the tune of $750,000 when I ran for re-election. There would have been a lot more respect given in this place. And there would have been
winning re-election at 57% is not exactly a small achievement in the current environment. Just saying.
No, but listen, and I appreciate it, and listen, as they say it in our world of mayors, black or white, Republican, Democrat, Independent, 50 plus one, just as long as I have one more vote than the next person, and you are that. But at the same time, when you believe that you have done, yeoman's work, you want to see that appreciation. I mean, I'm no different now. I keep my head down and I'm focused. And that appreciation has come from black voters. I make no mistake about that. I just think that we're still dealing with the construct of race here in Montgomery in the South as we are in this nation. And we're still trying to figure that out. And I had, again, mayors from Mark Morial to even, Mitch Landrieu, Wellington Webb. I could go down the list. Many people who either their father or they themselves were first kind of tell me that, it's a process in any city, in any community, and you have to be prepared for that. And so we're still kind of going through that, but we know we haven't yet reached that smooth place. And I understand that, being from here.
This is a question about that. Is what about the riverboat brawl that captured so much of our attention earlier this year? We all saw it. It was national news. It was really a kind of a fascinating kind of case study in something. But what do you think that was all about? What's your take on it?
Well, I think it was certainly a case study in terms of sociology. I have said, for many years that I think the racial rhetoric has been amplified since Donald Trump was running for office, much less after he got in. And so, I talk a lot about race in a different way that for some is a little rough, if you will. It's a little bit in your face, but it's the reality that we have to deal with because, sometimes when you try to use nuance, it doesn't quite hit the same. And I do this in public. I do it in private. I feel that's part of my responsibility as the first Black mayor of a city like Montgomery, with a history based in civil rights as well as the Confederacy. So when I think about the riverfront brawl that happened, I think it was a collection of things that took place of people really seeing that as symbolic of, a white gentleman taking an approach to somebody black doing their job, and he was someone white who's on the boat itself, and just having not having any regard for their authority, not having any regard for their position, and not really respecting that person's position. Maybe had they would have if that person was of a different race. And I think the response to that was because they saw a individual and then a collection of individuals say, well, we're not going to stand for that. And
were you surprised by the whole thing? I mean, was it, there's always so interesting reactions, closer to the story and then outside of the story. Like I remember when, former Mississippi Senator Trent Lott made his kind of famous remarks about how things would be different if Strom Thurmond had, won the presidency. And, it lost him his position as majority leader of the Senate. I mean, it's facts, or the Republican leader of the Senate, that facts. But I remember talking to a number of people, kind of closer to the story, and they were like, yeah. And, and so I'm just asking you, were you surprised?
At the response or the national reaction?
Both.
That it happened
and then the reaction to it.
Well, I had just left from down there. It was a back to school event that was maybe, I don't know, a couple hundred yards away at our amphitheater. And so I had just left probably within the hour, probably within 30 minutes. So when we got the call over the radio, my first thought was, how violent was it? Was anyone hurt? And, had anyone been seriously hurt? And, when I got word that no weapons were used, I kind of, relaxed, to be honest with you. It was not until the next day and I saw the video on social media that I was like, oh, wow, okay. You don't see things like that happen these days quite a lot. And so it was a surprise to me. And I think I was even more surprised by how social media amplified it and then, use it as a symbol for so many other things. And
I want to move on from this because we only have a couple minutes left and I do want to hear more things, but why do you think it evoked the response that it did?
I think it summed up how a lot of people feel themselves. I think it summed up how a lot of people would like to react, and we're glad to see a good Samaritan come to the aid of another in that case for something that was unprovoked in their minds and something that never should have happened. And I think because of the backdrop of Montgomery and what the bus boycott, the sale to Montgomery, March for Voting Rights, all of those things, I think because of the civil rights backdrop, just amplified adversity if it happened in some other, mid-sized or big city, that might have been a little different. But I think the backdrop just fit with this narrative of all that has happened in our city and in our region, how things happened then, and how people have, responded in that situation just a few months ago.
What role do you think, the Legacy Museum and the Civil Rights Memorial is in Montgomery? Part of your message as mayor, part of the reason you ran for mayor, you ran for re-election as mayor, is you want to move Montgomery forward, right? While acknowledging the history, but also move the city forward. The Civil Rights Museum, the Legacy Museum, and the Civil Rights Memorial has become a major tourist attraction, correct?
Yeah.
How is that landing there? I mean, on the one hand, this recalls some of the most painful chapters of our history. On the other hand, it is a major tourist attraction. What do you think that means? And as briefly as you can.
I think there's more work for us to do locally here to understand that and really appreciate it. I think it's certainly appreciated in certain circles outside of the city and state, to where we are the #1 city for international travel in the state of Alabama, in large part because of that. People coming from all over the world to see it. But I think that what I have shared here is that we have to make sure that our practices match our talk, or our policies match kind of what we say we're going to do. And that's what I still have a challenge getting our leadership to do. And it's something I hope that we can improve on over the next 4 years. But we're glad that it's here. It is something that is a jewel, not only for the city and the state, but I think for the nation and beyond. And it's something for all of us to learn, because each time I take someone through it, or I go through it myself, I pick up something new that I didn't know about our history. And I think that's the key part I'll leave you with, is that I think it shows so much of the history that is not taught, that in this day and age, when we are taking books off shelves and we're saying what authors, can't be, talked about in our schools around the country, that it shows us just how much was never taught and how much more around this country's imperfections we need to learn about in order to get to that more perfect union. We can't get there without knowing the mistakes and knowing some of the issues that we've had in the past and we continue to have now.
So, Mayor, there's so much in your book that's interesting, and some things to chew on. There's so much there for people who are either of the Moses generation, the Joshua generation, as whatever you want to call it. I was impressed with how you talked about the importance of daycare or childcare in allowing people to fulfill their potential. So there's a lot here, but we have just a couple of minutes left, and I kind of wanted to ask you to leave us with a closing thought. I mean, if there's one thing you'd want us to be thinking about, as we finish our conversation with you today, what would it be?
I think as late Congressman John Lewis said that, the march continues. And I think that we have to keep in mind, even though we're in these positions, and I tell people, I like this office because it is the office of the mayor since 1937 here in Montgomery. It's this physical space. And so a lot happened right outside of these walls, and a lot happened here that I think we have to keep in mind that while it has changed and while there's been progress, there's still so much more for us to do. But I don't want us to be burdened by that. I think in looking at the Moses generation and looking at my parents and what their generation overcame, and many of our parents and grandparents overcame, it shows what can happen in this country in a short amount of time with courage, commitment, and conviction. And for those young leaders, in particular those young boys and those young girls, young men and young women that are challenged by thinking it has to be all or nothing. If I'm not perfect, I'm not superhuman, I can't lead, I can't be a positive force. That's just not true. And I hope that that's a takeaway when they read First Best or they listen to it, that they see themselves and inspires and motivates them to come and take the baton from even those of us in the Joshua generation and continue the race and continue to run further and faster than even we can. And I think as long as we do that and we keep that at the forefront of where we're trying to go, we'll all see benefits from it, even through the struggles, even through some of the challenges that we are trying to deal with today. We have the potential, due to our past and due to what we know we have come through in this country, to overcome that. And we just have to make sure that we're uplifting those who are trying to do it, even through their mistakes, even through some of their missteps, that we see in them those things that the previous generation saw in us.
Mayor Stephen L. Reed, your new book, it's called First Best. I think it's available now. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. So much to talk about. Thank you so much for talking with us tonight.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for joining us for this conversation. We do hope you'll come back to future conversations. Good night.